dear professors, dear students, dear friends. It's a very special pleasure and honor for me to be here with you and to have a chance to be a witness of this extremely moving ceremony. I've been on the verge of singing Gaudeamus Igitur myself. Yet I have to confess that when Rector Handar called me and asked me to be a keynote speaker on your inauguration ceremony, I first had doubts. I'm a poor teacher, and no teacher at all. Not the person to address the students on the inauguration day. As a writer, I always preferred learning myself than teaching the others. Yet, these dark times that appear in the title of my talk made me to change my mind, because learning, after all, is also about sharing. There is no point in learning something for yourself only. And I think in these days like this, nowadays, as a citizen and a writer of the country which for 7 months by now has been under a war attack unprecedented since the World War II in the scale of our civilization, I do have something to share with you on what arts is, as I see it nowadays. This is what it is for me. I'll start with an example which can be a model, serve as a model to analyze. Several months ago, on the day of the graduation ceremony in Ukraine's high schools, in Kharkiv, which, as you may know, has been under permanent shelling since the beginning of the Russian invasion, the graduates of the Kharkiv school, which was destroyed in one of the very first battles for Kharkiv that were taken place in February, decided to pay homage to their school by coming to dance their prom waltz on the cleaned up sport court among the ruins. Their performance was widely publicized by TV, by social media. You can take your time and watch it on YouTube or tens of other publics. And try to find your own answer to the question I am about to pose today here. That is, why an amateurish dance by 10 young people has been qualified by hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of viewers all over the world as arts. And by many mistaken for an art happening, mostly, of course, by foreigners who were not aware of the context and were criticizing this performance as an art happening for the choice of too sad music. Music. They were dancing to the song of the young Ukrainian rapper Jerry Hale, and the lyrics make quite a meaningful part of the performance. Of course, there was also the critique on the gender disbalance, like too many girls, 7 girls to 3 boys. Something could have been changed here. Of course, foreign viewers were not aware of the fact that nothing could have been changed down here, because this 10 young men, 7 girls, and 3 boys were those who were left out of their entire class in Kharkiv. The rest of their classmates fled the city as refugees, inner or international refugees, fleeing from under the Russian bombs. So it was not any conceptual idea of a choreographer, this gender disbalance. But anyway, that's, I would say, exactly the point where true art, or more precisely, what is learnable in art, begins. When you know how to turn your disadvantages into advantages, your weakness into your strengths. Yet the performance of the Kharkiv students reminds us all of something even more essential. Namely, that art, in the end, is nothing but the most concentrated, and so far the only one truly successful human response to the challenge of mortality. We draw and paint, we sing and dance, we write books and take pictures, not so much for a need of self-expression, like we are taught to believe, as for the profound existential desire which is present in every human being, the desire to reach beyond the current limits of our terminate existence, to grasp a glimpse of beauty before it vanishes, or in other words, to conquer time. Dancing a prom waltz in front of the destroyed school by 7 girls and 3 boys dressed in black and white was by no means designed as an art happening. It was a very real thing which they did out of their emotional need to say goodbye to the school where they had spent 2/3 of their lives, that is 11 years out of 17. The years, the physical evidence of which they then had one night been watching disappearing in the fire. It is a serious loss at any age to be robbed of 2/3 of your life.
to have it visually and tangibly deleted, so that you can never be back to the same familiar, comfortably smelling class of yours to enjoy your defrosted childhood memories. Many writers, Marcel Proust among the most frequently quoted ones, left us volumes written about the power which places have over our memory, and when not they write. A considerable part of those young people's memory was thus irretrievably stolen from them by war, a damage hardly to be repaired. They may be not quite fully aware of that, but in a way their dance turned out to be no short of a mourning rite over their common loss, a burial service performed over the dead body of their school. Notably, that's exactly the point when art entered human history, when people start burying their dead and mourning their loved ones. Kharkiv students may not have been aware of that either. Art, after all, is not about awareness, it's about sensitivity. Yet, along with their choreographer, they managed to hit the right nerve. The view of the group of young people dancing in the ruins, what was recognized by many, even if not necessarily appreciated, as memorial dance, reaches to the very core of the millenniums-old art mystery. It cancels the very physicality of ruins, the dreadful, terrifying power of destruction, the death itself. Once and again, as it used to happen and would be happening thousands of times in the history of art, love wins over death. Mortality gets defeated. Small and fragile, black and white dressed human figures against the backdrop of the half-ruined wall, their laconic, minimalistic, almost solemn movements with elements of the folk magic, like girls round the clock circle, to the sound of the evenly fragile, almost breaking girl's voice singing about a freedom which cannot be killed, not even when happiness is gone, with the line of the refrain which sounds chilling like a spell chanting, even if you don't understand the language. Кожен буде жати, що посіяв. Every one of them will reap what they sow. All this is undoubtedly a show worth being named a piece of art, no matter it never so intended. It has all the necessary elements of a true art work. First, a genuine emotion which resists human mortality, emotion in this case strong enough to destroy a person's life unless translated into some cultural experience and communicated, transmitted to the others. Secondly, a language of its own. A language both appealing to the identifiable cultural images present in the current tradition, like ruins, Rome dance, the juxtaposition of them, of the two, and in the same time undermining transforming these images. And point 3, a bit of artistry, so to speak, or professional skills shown by the choreographer, who incidentally initially was hired by the school to teach the kids to dance their first waltz at the prom. Well, and with the war ended up having created this memorial dance, which turns into what can be duly called the birth dance of the war generation. A military magic, I dare say. And by such a close-up, I'm trying to show you the close-up of the case, just one case, which will probably never make it to the catalogs of this year art happenings. I'm trying to show you that our civilization has entered the grand turbulence zone, when only too many things which my generation was taught to believe were determinative are going to be very seriously tested. In Ukraine, since 2014, I keep reiterating, whenever asked to speak to the young people, please, dear children, forgive us. We were preparing you for a totally different world. So the only thing I may know for sure nowadays is that no one in this madly changing world of ours, with its melting ice caps, crumbling empires, reawakening viruses, and reappearing totalitarianisms, should be able to define with full authority what art is and what art is not, as long as it satisfies the 3 requirements I have mentioned above. And for the dark times like this, I would probably add one more criterion to this above-mentioned 3. That the true art would rarely bring upon you the immediate gratification or business-like success. Yet with certainty it is inclined to inflict upon you many risks and altogether rather a precarious life. Insisting on a language of one's own, on an artistic language of one's own, which, as I mentioned, is one of the definite signs of true art, can be a dangerous business too. And in the current war which Russia conducts in Ukraine, this so-called annihilation war, which aims for nothing less than to destroy the country completely, assaulted quite deliberately is the country's cultural heritage. That is, the language which country speaks to the world. For it is culture, it is arts. which makes the major language which every country speaks to the world, addresses the world. What the aggressor cannot appropriate as Russian, what cannot be simply looted and moved to Russia, as, for instance, the priceless paintings by Arkhip Kuinji from Mariupol were looted. Well, everything gets assaulted. According to the Ministry of Cultural and Information Policy of Ukraine, since February 24, Russian troops have ruined or damaged 464 cultural sites in Ukraine, including a few of those being on Ukraine's tentative list of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, such as the gems of the 11th century church architecture in Chernihiv, or the celebrated constructivist skyline of Kharkiv's city center. By no means could these destructions be passed off as collateral damage. They came as the enactment of the policy which had been declared by the Russian authorities many times before, yet never taken into account by the collective West, by the rest of the world, with due graveness. You may duly ask, why? How come that it is only now that the Kremlin's goal to annihilate Ukrainian culture has become visible and subsequently has made visible for the first time for only too many around the world the very fact that Ukraine does boast a millennium-old culture of its own, the culture so rich and ancient that it might awaken in a neighbor a burning envy and a herostratic desire to wipe it out. Putin is not doing anything innovative in this regard. He's just continuing the policy of cultural annihilation, which was typical for the Russian Empire, as well as, with a couple of brief interludes, for the Soviet one. We recently marked the 70th anniversary of the destruction of the Ukrainian collection of the National Museum in Lviv, a perfect analogy of the Nazi degenerate art tragedy, when in 3 short days, beginning on July 31st, 1952, over 2,000 works of art by the leading artists of Ukrainian avant-garde, like Alexander Archipenko, Alexander Murashko, Alexander Bohomazov, Mikhailo Boychuk, and others, were destroyed, the paintings burned in furnaces, sculptures shattered with hammers, and swept away like litter. Putin has not invented anything new. His army, be it soldiers, propagandists, or teachers for that matter, is going on with the same hammers, if only symbolical or metaphorical. How is it, you may ask, that so little on this subject makes to the international news? And you hear far less of the short monuments in Bucha and Drushkivka, or the 19th century Polovtsian sacred statues, the stone babas in the steppe under Izum, than on the, say, damaged gas pipes in the Baltic Sea. Does it mean that art is not important? It doesn't matter? It's just a niche in our world? On the contrary, I dare say. The fact that it is under attack is unfortunately the best proof so far how much important, how crucial and vital the art is. The bad news being, however, that we live in the world where art of the country is not backed by tanks and missiles, is much less likely to gain a hearing on the world's stage. A decade before Putin, it was Taliban, which had similarly tested our determination to protect arts with the same poor result. I know only too many Europeans who had first heard of the 15th century's old Buddhas of Bamiyan Valley only after the statues were destroyed. And one cannot feel grievance over the loss of something one never knew was there. That is why the path for tanks is always paved by ignorance. While the world is now trying to count how many civilians were killed in Mariupol, I can't but keep thinking of one more killing which has passed unnoticed. Mariupol used to boast 2 mosaics. Okay, thank you. By Alla Horska, the leading Ukrainian monumental artist of the 60s, a woman of a great talent and also a great spirit which has determined her tragic fate in the Soviet times. Defiant and uncompromising, Alla Horska was assassinated by the KGB in 1970. And her recognized masterpieces I want to show you. This is the Tree of Life. And this is Borey Viter, mythological tree from the Ukrainian folklore. Both dating to 1967, used to decorate one of the Mariupol restaurants. So 55 years later, and 52 years after Horska's death, Russian missiles turned them into this. That's how artists can be murdered posthumously by killing their works. That's the proof how important they are. It is now up to your generation to find an answer to the question which keeps bothering me for all this time, for all these months. Is it possible that where Horska's story for the past half a century was included into all the world textbooks on art history of the 20th century, then her Mariupol mosaics could have survived, or at least were having a better chance for survival? Yes, it is up to your generation to find an answer to this question. You are entering a very unfair world while being endowed with most fragile, yet also with most precious gift, artistic talent. So in a way, you are already dancing on the ruins like your Kharkiv counterparts, only maybe without knowing it yet. May your dance mark the birth of the better world. Vivat Academia! Thank you.